Hi everybody, it's Jessica from ChambrayBluesSewing. I'm here with a quick tutorial on grain lines and why it's important. So as you know, your fabric will have a cross grain and a straight grain. So when we say it's the straight of the grain, all you need to do to find that is to look at your selvages. That is the straight grain of the fabric. So if I hold my fabric straight up and down, this is a stripe. I'm using it just to show you an illustration. It's a little bit easier to imagine with the stripe. It's helpful. So this is the straight line of my fabric. It's parallel to the selvage, therefore it is on the straight of the grain. If I was to make something on the cross grain, it would be the other direction, parallel to the cut end of your fabric. That is the cross grain. It has less stretch than this. It has more stretch, I should say, more stretch than the straight grain will have. And the reason it's important to know which grain you're dealing with when you're working with apparel is because things will not hang straight if you get it wrong. If you cut your garment on the cross grain, it's going to look very different from a garment that's cut on the straight grain. So in my example here, the stripes are perfectly straight and the garment will have a nice hang and drape to it on the straight grain. If I take my fabric and I move it to the cross grain, it's going to look very different. So now, as you can see, I have a much stiffer drape. I get these it's completely stiff. It doesn't conform to the body as much. It is the cross grain. So that's why it's important that you cut things on the right grain when you're cutting out a sewing pattern. One more thing to note, if you are supposed to cut something on the bias has the most stretch and give in your fabric, and that is diagonal. So if I cut my fabric here on the bias, true bias is exactly 45 degrees. I'm going to get a nice smooth fit. It conforms to the body really well, and it's also very flattering for any type of figure. However, if you take a bias pattern and try and cut it on the straight, it's not going to work. They are designed very differently. Bias cut fabrics will stretch a lot more, and that's why you always need to hang a full circle skirt before you hem it because of the bias that it has. So keep that in mind when you're working with patterns that call for cutting on the bias. It has to be cut on the bias or it's not going to fit. One other thing to note is that when you're working with knits, all these rules are very different. So a knit fabric usually has stretch across the grain and not so much in the length, which is different than a woven fabric would be. And for knit fabrics, you don't necessarily need to cut things on the bias because you already have enough stretch across the fabric and you don't need the bias stretch. But rules can be broken with knits a little bit more than with wovens. Wovens, it's really important to get it on the straight grain. And when you're cutting a pattern with the straight grain, make sure you measure either from the folded edge or from the selvages so that your pattern is completely parallel to the straight grain. Because if it's off a little bit, it's not going to look right. So here it's completely straight, but if I kind of cut it off, you see how weird that looks? It sort of hangs funny. You get funny curls and lumps in the fabric. That's why it's important that your pattern is cut exactly on the straight grain. So make sure it's on the straight. If you're not sure if you got the straight grain in the fabric, hold it up to yourself in a mirror and look at it and see how the folds are draping. You can tell the difference between a straight grain and a cross grain. It's not really hard when you do cross grain, it's very different. It is just straight as a, doesn't have any ease to it. It's very different than the lengthwise grain of a fabric. So that's your 2 minutes tutorial today. Follow me on social media and my channel, and make sure and share this with another beginner sewer because it's something that they would need to know. Have a great day.